Hello friends, welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am Dr. Anurekha Chariwag, Assistant Professor, Department of Sociology, Savitribai Phule, Pune University. We are going to discuss a paper titled Emergent Discourse on Displacement and Resettlement. This paper is part of the larger paper on agrarian social structure and change that is coordinated by Dr. Manish Thakur of IIM Kolkata. In this paper, we are going to focus on the concept of eminent domain, which has led us to an understanding of the contested nature of property within India. Further, we will also look into the basic premise of land acquisition laws, especially in the context of both colonial and independent India. In this module, we will also look into the relationship between land and development. And while doing so, we will also look into the rise of transnational capitalism that has played a very important role in the whole addressing of the land question in India. The emergent discourse on displacement and resettlement, protest and governmental responses. Land plays a pivotal role in the socio-economic fabric of India. It is a reflection and measure of power. Further, it determines one's position in the social order, and the primary means of production in India is an agricultural country. Bremen argues individuals' ownership to land is a determinant for access to employment and to monetary yield. Land is an important source of livelihood, as a majority of population is dependent upon land or directly or indirectly for their economic activities. It is a focal point for livelihood not only for landed farmers but also for others like subsistence farmers, landless laborers who work on employers' farms, artisans and cattle rearers. The larger the land holding, the more the people would be employed to work upon these lands. Land accomplishes dual purposes of insurance function and income function. When other forms of income generation fail, land comes to the rescue, as it can be sold and capital can be generated. Land also acts as a reserve pool of capital for contingencies like drought, marriage, death, crop failure, illness, etc. Thus, it performs the insurance function. Along with this, land performs the income function. Peasants can either farm on it directly or can lease out and earn rent. People do not see land as a source of income alone. For them, land is a source of prestige and social esteem. Land ownership, besides being a status symbol, is also a resource for emotional connect and identity. Land is also the umbilical cord for cultural existence. In a way, land is not only a source of livelihood but also a way of life. A piece of land, large or small, is shared among siblings, and the collective existence is tied to the land and to each other. Mostly it is land and its landed property that one inherits from forefathers. There is one more aspect that makes land so dear to people. They do not want to part with their ancestral property. As land plays a central role in people's lives and livelihood, dispossession from land is bound to be a contentious issue. Dispossession from land is more than mere economic deprivation. It is disrupting life, lifestyle, relationship and socio-cultural identity. For generations, people have known not any other way of existing. A considerable proportion of land belonging to farmers and tribals is not their own earning but their inherited property. For a majority of farmers and tribals, land is one of the most important assets and sometimes the only asset that they have. It is undisputed that there exists an emotional bonding between the farmer and the land. But more importantly, land is a source of employment and livelihood to the farmer, and land does not give him a high quality of life, but it helps him to eke out a living and to be somewhat food assured. A farmer does not become jobless as long as he has some access to land. In difficult times, farmers can fall back upon land, which constitutes their security. Alienation from land means being thrown into new kinds of unknown uncertainties, and the risk for land is a cumulative representation of socio-cultural economic identity. In this module, we will try to understand the concept of eminent domain, which forms the basic premise of land acquisition laws in colonial as well as democratic India. We would deliberate upon the change in people's perception about this exercise of eminent domain by the state. We will also try to look into the relationship between land and development and how this has historically evolved, the rise of the transnational capitalism and its impact on the acquisition of land, and the attendant problems of displacement and rehabilitation. Eminent domain. Land is one of the most important factors of production. Historically, land has been acquired for developmental and industrial purposes. Colonial rulers have been credited with the development of some of the very basic and modern institutions in our country, the most prominent of being the railways. The British laid down extensive railway networks spanning the length and breadth of India. Rail tracks were not laid in a vacuum or an unoccupied land solely. A huge displacement of people took place, be it establishment of industries or huge mansions and monuments. Displacement and possession of people from the land has always been there. The justification of this displacement and dispossession was premised on the doctrine of an eminent domain. It presumes a priority to the requirements of the state, which by definition is for the general good of the public over the interest of landowners and users. In the Indian context, eminent domain implies the power to take private property for public use by the state, municipality, or private person or corporation authorized to exercise functions of public character following the payment of just compensation to that owner of property. There are two major aspects of eminent domain: the sovereign authority of the state and the discretion to decide what constitutes public purpose. State is sovereign and so has a legitimate right to acquire private property for public purposes. The canon of eminent domain embedded in land acquisition laws assumes sovereign power for public purpose and invests power in the state to acquire private land for public purpose and payment of compensation. The state has sovereign authority to acquire land for any immovable property, but along with that, it is unequivocally imperative that the acquired land be used for public purpose for the good of the community at large. It can be argued that when some public value is created with such acquired land, it will eventually benefit those people who also had to forego their properties. Sampath argues that the doctrine of eminent domain has extra constitutional and pre-democratic moorings in India. Eminent domain is often linked to the idea of modernity, development, industrialization, progress, and technological superiority and urbanization. In the name of ultimate upliftment of those deprived from the lands, land acquisition has been vigorously pursued by the state, initiated by the colonial rulers to facilitate better governance of the colonies. It is extensively used for the democratic state as well in the name of greater common good. Giving up land for development of industries was seen as a mark of patriotism and nationalism. There are abundant examples of philanthropic living, of giving of land willingly as people wanted to participate in nation building. Nascent Indian state needed land for establishment of industries and institutes for undoing centuries of subjugation and retarded development. People were so tired of impoverishment and backwardness that nation building was a desire and dream not only of social and political elites but also marginal farmers and laborers. With the euphoria around nationalism and nation building in the post-independence period, the idea of eminent domain started superseding individual rights. It is estimated that the state has dispossessed at least 50 million people of the land and the livelihoods under Colonial Land Acquisition Act of 1894. This dispossession was by virtue of exercising the powers of eminent domain. Instead of allowing a broad and egalitarian interpretation, the eminent domain is often used as a tool to justify coercive practices of the state on behalf of the private capitalist. This capital can be domestic or transnational. Eminent domain is also the basic premise for the redistributive justice on which land reforms were constructed. It involves state intervention to redistribute land among the landless and put a ceiling on landholding capacities. However, land reform soon lost political expedience as they encountered resistance from landed elite with direct electoral implications for political parties. In such a situation, using eminent domain as a base for appropriation of land for non-agricultural uses led to disruption. Under the pretext of economic growth, eminent domain is being used to further the interest of capitalism. It is argued that constitutional status of the doctrine of eminent domain and the unqualified removal of the right to property as a fundamental right without attention to existing social, political and economic inequalities resulted in making Dalits, Adivasis, poor peasants and urban poor most vulnerable to the exercise of eminent domain. The state aligned its plans of development with that of the capitalists and started acquiring, transferring land to the corporations, leading to dispossession and displacement. The state turns out to be adversarial to the interest of the dispossessed people. Land and development. As land has emerged as one of the bigger constraints on development in recent years, there have been a lot of protests against the indiscriminate usurpation of land for development purposes. The case of Nandigram is an apt example. Saling Group was allowed by the West Bengal government to establish a chemical hub in Nandigram. The Saling Group was allowed under the Special Economic Zone policy. However, the local villagers opposed the construction and the brutal clash between the police and the citizens followed. It reported that 40 people died in the incidents. Developing countries in general and India in particular have witnessed a change in the pattern of development. There are three important factors of production: land, labor and capital. Labor has always been abundant in India, land and capital being constraining factors. In recent times, capital has ceased to be a constraining factor due to a number of reasons. The marginal propensity to save has increased in developing countries like India and China. As these countries are heavily populated, an incremental increase in savings lead to considerable escalation in available capital. This is complemented by the inflow of huge foreign capital into developing countries in form of foreign direct investments. More capital is available as international institutions like IMF and World Bank finance projects in developing countries. These favorable conditions for development leave only land as a determining and constraining factor for development. The main issue before the state and the investors is to acquire land in a peaceful manner so that the process of capital accumulation and growth continues. Industrialization necessitates acquisition of land to set up new industries. Industrialization increases growth rate, which means a faster rate of conversion of agricultural land to industrial land. The demand for non-agricultural land is rising consistently along with the growing economy and the transition from an agrarian economy to an industrial economy. Land acquisition is a process by which government acquires land for various economic and infrastructure projects. In certain situations, it can also mean acquisition by a private person authorized to do so by the government. Land acquisition imperils livelihoods of people concerned and hence has to be accompanied by fair compensation. The Right to Fair Compensation and Transparency in Land Acquisition, Rehabilitation and Resettlement Act 2013 has substituted the Land Acquisition Act of 1894 in India. Inadequate compensation, adverse economic impact are the major problems related to land acquisition in India. Land acquisition as a process is undergoing significant transitions: political, economic, social, environment and spatial. Land Acquisition Act has been used in combination of several other acts which are sector or project specific. National Highway Act, Indian Railway Act and state-specific versions of Land Acquisition Act are a few of these. India being predominantly an agrarian society, the contention around land acquisition is not merely limited to the quantum of compensation. Land is a pivot of agrarian structure. Acquisition of agricultural land disrupts this agrarian structure. This disruption is the main reason behind the protest against land acquisition. Land is an emotive issue closely linked to identity and livelihood, and forcible acquisition of land is bound to generate more protest. Pre-independence land acquisition. Colonial administration had massive development projects of road, railways, canals and other infrastructure. These developments were primarily to expand and facilitate colonial rule. However, the advantages spilled over to the Indian society. Various acts like the Bengal Regulation of 1824 were enacted for easy acquisition of land from pre-independence presidencies. Arbitrators were appointed for determining the compensation for such acquisition, which was essentially for public works. Since colonial rule, under all circumstances, the sovereign government had legitimate rights within certain limitations to acquire land. There is no legal provision for contesting acquisition. Objection can only be raised against the amount of compensation paid or the process of payment thereof. The thumb rule for compensation has been the market value. Compensation has to be in accordance with the market value at the time of acquisition. Effective rehabilitation and resettlement of the displaced, the fair, prompt, adequate and effective payment of compensation and other such issues have come to the fore in recent times. International laws and public interest litigations have played a prominent role in bringing about this change in discourse. Moving from province subjective regulations, the Land Acquisition Act of 1894 was a step towards establishing uniformity in acquisition of land across India. It was also a ploy of the colonial powers to legitimize their authority. British Empire was consolidating its rule across India, and the single law helped them immensely in administration. The peculiarity of this act in 1894 lies in the fact that it is legitimized government acquisition of land and other immovable assets for development purposes. It is only after the non-cooperation movement in 1923 that an amendment was made in this act. After the 1923 amendment, objections could be raised against land acquisition. Indian leaders became the part of the local administration after 1923, and even after considerable deliberation, the Act did not provide that the persons having an interest in specific land had the right to object to such acquisition. The monetary compensation paid to the landowners was in accordance with the market price of the land prevalent at that time. There were discrepancies in the process of deciding the amount of compensation, but nevertheless, a due process of law for acquisition was followed. In the colonial rule, no provision for the rehabilitation and resettlement of the displaced or dispossessed was present. It should be noted here that the land acquisition did not displace only the landed farmers, but several other categories of people who were directly or indirectly dependent on land for livelihood and subsistence. This included the landless farmers, farm laborers, families of the farmers, sharecroppers, artisans, etc. This unrestrained power of acquisition of land by sovereign government continued in the post-independence India as well. Post-independence land acquisition. Ideally, the oppressive laws and policies of the colonial rulers should have been annulled after independence. However, this seldom happened in public administration or in legislature. Post-independence public administration bureaucracy continues to have essential characteristics that it had pre-independence, with minor changes in its structure. Same is true for legislatures. Part 20 of the Constitution of India maintains that all pre-independence laws will be applicable post-independence also. Any pre-constitutional law, when in conflict with the Constitution provision, will be void up to the extent of such a conflict. The continuation of pre-independence laws was an easy way to settle the contentious issues like property, trade and land acquisition, etc. This was essentially for facilitating establishment of heavy industries as part of the planned development for modernizing Indian state. Several key and heavy industries like steel and automobiles were promoted. Developing indigenous industries acquired land, and as the Act of 1894 was coherent with the needs of the time. This act was not repealed but amended in a staggered manner. This allowed enough discretion to the newly formed government to acquire land in the name of developing the nascent industry. The theoretical premise of eminent domain was employed to legitimize the actions of the government and other authorized private players. It is in this context that the right to property, which was included in fundamental rights, was amended. Right to property was in direct conflict with the massive plans of Government of India for industrialization. Deletion of the right to property from the list of fundamental rights paved the way for the legislations that deprived citizens of the property. Such acts of government got legitimized under Constitution. Landmark judgments like Kesavananda Bharati versus State of Kerala were pronounced, which further legitimized state's action as far as expropriation of land was concerned. The definition of public use was interpreted widely by the courts in several other landmark judgments pertaining to land legislation. The judiciary vehemently protected the state interest in several cases filed against the government for acquisition of land. Conflicts and legislative responses. The rate of growth of the economy has increased substantially, and this has led to the increase in the demand for land for non-agricultural purposes. Post-independence India has witnessed the greatest expansion of non-agricultural sector. However, in the initial decades after independence, protests on the issues of displacement were not so common. One, the legal framework was not democratic but was colonial, and it paved the way for land acquisition without much legal recourse left for the dispossessed. Second, the civil society and the non-governmental organizations were not so vigilant, partly because of a long history of colonial oppression and partly because it was the ethos of nationalism which coaxed the citizens to bequeath the lands for nation building. Third, the demand for land was considerably low as a large section of population was agrarian and industrialization was at its nascent stage. Industrialization brings with itself a set of other developmental requirements like proper roads, railways, electricity, coal storage, ports, etc. In advanced stages of industrialization, land is also required to provide for these complementary activities and sectors. This increases the pressure on land as it happening in India in recent times. It would be wrong to assume that the process of land acquisition was as smooth and sans any hiccups after independence. Both the framework for acquisition and attitude towards acquisition in popular imagination was different. Maybe strict draconian legal instruments were enough to discourage people from protesting. In fact, a sacrifice was demanded from the displaced for the larger good, and the agitations that took place were extremely local in nature and ruthlessly crushed. These days, an increasing amount of land is being required for non-agricultural purposes. These non-agricultural purposes can be industrial or developmental in nature, like creating houses for urban dwellers, highways, commercial complexes, or shopping malls. Allegedly, the state has displaced and pauperized millions of people in the countryside. The state is increasingly playing the role of a promoter of a corporate-led economic growth, which is underlined by acquisition of land and subsequent transfer of this land to the developers. Acquisitions, displacement, compensation, and rehabilitation thus gets pushed into the private arena, compensation potentially negotiated by the market and without state's responsibility for rehabilitation. The reason behind the protest is a change in the people's perception of the state. As there is increased alignment of the state interest with corporate interest, which has the state acquiring and transferring land to the corporations, has dispossessed and displaced persons and communities, seeing the state as adversarial to their interest. This is one of the major reasons for the farmers' agitation and violent conflicts with the state with regard to possible land acquisition. Development of infrastructure and industry was coupled with the expropriation of property from people who did not necessarily gain from such expropriation. The public value thus created did not reach the affected proportionately as they were displaced and dispossessed, and the rehabilitation issues were not addressed. After the economic liberation in 1990s, the problems of displacement aggravated as the demand for getting land, which is often fertile for agriculture by private players, has tremendously increased, and the governments are found to fight with farmers in acquiring land for industrialists. In the wake of economic reforms, such conflicts have become more widespread and violent. Initially, the patriotic nationalist zeal would make the land acquisition and related practices of the state somehow palatable. It was considered a matter of pride and patriotism to relinquish land for developmental purposes, as some people felt that they are contributing towards nation building. The reason for the surge in popular agitations on the issue can be attributed to the adoption of liberalization policy, growing land acquisition for the private sector, and the like. In the last one decade, the drive for rapid industrialization and urbanization has led to increased pace of land acquisitions and subsequently the rise of large number of protests by farmers on the issue of land acquisition. In the pre-liberalization period, the government provided protection for agricultural land. Sampath, however, sees an excess of legality, state power, and neoliberal capital. And the post-liberalization period leading to dispossession of farmers from the land. More and more land is being taken for industrial and commercial purposes as government moves away from land reform and effective protection of farmers' interests. A form of corporate imperialism is rampant, which pays no heed to the issues of farmers, resettlement, and rehabilitation. In the name of development and modernity, the idea of industrialization is being pushed in the developing countries. Yet industrialization in a country like ours leads to dispossession and exploitation of a large number of people who are dependent upon land for their livelihood. The rationale of common good fails to justify large-scale displacement. It should be noted here that dispossession from land has multiple implications. One, people are dispossessed from livelihood which they derive directly or indirectly from land. Two, the social and cultural life is disrupted. Three, the economic life is marred beyond repair. The people who are dependent on land have been in this business for generations. They do not know much beyond this. When they are alienated from their land, they turn towards urban informal sectors for employment. Indeed, a large number of industrial labor or the urban footloose labor has rural origins. After years of popular protest and violent agitation, we have a new policy on the issue. The Right to Fair Compensation and Transparency in Land Acquisition, Rehabilitation and Resettlement Act 2013. Despite its limitation, this is a much farmer-friendly than the older legislations on this issue. The legal framework pertaining to the land acquisition can be analyzed from three angles. The soul of the land acquisition law, or in that case, any law that is principle on which it is premised. The process of the implementation of the law and the compensation mechanism involved. As far as land acquisition law in India is concerned, there is no change in the philosophical premise. It was and is an eminent domain. The colonial rule used the Land Acquisition Act 1894, and the independent India deployed the same for decades with minor changes. Recently, though it has been replaced by this act, the philosophical premise of both these acts is eminent domain. The process of land acquisition has been far from being fair. It is neither consultative nor transparent. The present Act attempts to resolve some issues of transparency and accountability, but the distress situation de facto and de jure is far from ideal. As land is directly or indirectly linked to the issue of livelihood, the issue of compensation is multifaceted and often the most widely debated issue. Issue of land acquisition is linked to the compensation package offered to those who part with the land. Immediately after independence, large tracts of land were acquired by government for setting up industries and institutions. Huge steel plants, mining industries, power plants were established. Massive industrial development happened. It can be argued that the quantum of industrialization that happened immediately after independence was phenomenal, and such large-scale industrialization has not happened after liberalization. The difference between these phases is essentially the feeling of nationalism that was present among citizens then and not later. Citizens had immense faith in the government and the belief that acquisition for nation-building project. The broad framework of the process of land acquisition bill in 2013 is similar to the earlier colonial law it has annulled. Only major change that has been introduced is a survey of land prior to the notification of for acquisition. The notification is served to the landowners through the district magazine. There is no room for any negotiation before the notice is served. It is argued that the state role is that of a venture capitalist. The provision for objection to acquisition are unambiguously stated in the Bill 2013. The most important being the purpose of land acquisition. If the land being acquired is not to be used for any public purpose, then objection can be raised. The suitability of the land for the aforesaid purpose can also be questioned. The land acquisition should be proportionate to the requirement of the project, and more than necessary size of land should not be acquired. In case a proposed land acquisition causes displacement of people or affects their livelihood, an alternative piece of land is available that fits this bill, then objection can be raised. National Rehabilitation and Settlement Policy 2007 is an umbrella law which aims at protecting the lives and livelihoods of the displaced. However, it does not address the issue of displacement or dispossession per se. It broadly aims at regulating large-scale displacement of people for industrial and commercial purposes. It lays down certain guidelines for land acquisition, such as projects should be set up on non-agricultural lands, wasteland and arid lands as far as possible. The amount of land acquired should commensurate the project requirement. If there are some alternative piece of land available, then acquisition of agricultural land or land with habitation should be avoided. If it is imperative to acquire agricultural land in specific area, then a single crop land should be preferred over multi-crop land. Grazing ground should be preferred over single crop land, and so on. Acquisition of irrigated land should be kept to minimum. In short, this policy urges that land acquisition to be a well thought out process. Pieces of land should not be usurped randomly. The consequences of land acquisition on lives and livelihood of people, as well as its environmental impact and broader socio-cultural impact, should be borne in mind. Be it railways or the huge army cantonments during colonial rule, or the power plants or mines after independence, multifarious projects displace farmers and peasants from the land. We should realize that a number of massive industries and institutions have been established on fertile lands after independence. Majority of protests against land acquisition are for the basic reason that enough compensation is not paid to the dispossessed people who depend on land for their livelihood. If the fair compensation mechanisms are in place, a considerable proportion of protests can be handled and mitigated. More often than not, subjective and suboptimal methods are galore as far as compensation is concerned. Alternative livelihood should be provided as part of the compensation in combination with monetary compensation. This has been done by few enterprises but not all. It is not necessary that giving jobs in emergent industries is the only way of securing livelihood for the displaced. Alternate tracts of lands can also be allocated. However, it should not be the case that arid land is given in lieu of fertile land. Alternative land allocation should be done treating community as a unit of collective existence. The major use of agricultural land is for development purposes, as building of shopping malls, residential complexes, highways, petrol pumps. This does not automatically constitute public purpose. The rationale of public purpose is that along with others it eventually benefits the ones who have been dispossessed. However, such acquisitions for building urban housing or multiplexes disproportionately benefit some sections of society. The benefits do not percolate to the marginalized and pauperized to the extent that they reach the capitalists and real estate developers. This is the main reason behind protest against acquisition of land. If this continues unabated, then many more protests will rise. Eminent domain cannot supersede the right of the people to determine their own future and development. Instead of being more vigilant in safeguarding the rights of the general populace, if the state further removes itself from the realm of accountability to the people, it notionally represents an electoral democratic system. More and more protests are around the corner. An example of this is a protest in Singur, Hooghly district in West Bengal. Tata Motors proposed to build Tata Nano plant in Singur. The plant was constructed, but the government faced opposition and its use of eminent domain was highly contested by the general public and opposition alike. Eventually, the project never took off and the acquired land is under litigation, and recently the court decided to ask the government to give back the land. Students, in concluding this module, we have looked into how there is an impact of land acquisition on the rural social structure. Further, we have also looked into the problems of displacement and rehabilitation as a result of land acquisition by the government for various development processes. We have also looked into the issues of protest which has come out from people in order to question the policies of land acquisition by the government of India. And we have also looked into the contested nature of compensation, which many of the people feel it is inadequate with regard to the kind of land that the government takes away in the name of development. At the end, we have also looked into the challenges in terms of implementation of laws, especially in terms of implementation of rehabilitation policies of the displaced people. Thank you.